The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
Down with the French-speaking Walloons and freedom for Flanders, that's what I say. It's where my forebears came from, you know, well, 3 of them anyway. Who's been sleeping in my porridge? Well, now I think we should leave the fantasy world of the news with all its fabulous fictional characters like Marylebone Rice Pudding and Screaming Lord Hume, hooray! And that well-known topical comedy team of Dimple Knees and Son. They don't really exist, you know, any more than the Bishop of Woolwich really exists. Just an idea in the mind of God. No, they make them. They make them up, you know. They have to do something, fill up the pages of the newspapers and so on. I mean, we know perfectly well that if there's no newspapers, I mean, if there's a strike or a public holiday or something, nothing happens. It's marvelous. Oh, tempora, oh mores, oh times, oh Daily Mirror. As Lord Denning said in his report, he said, none of this going around saying no smoke without fire. Nil combustibus pro fumo. No, I think we should. It's great fun. This whimsical world of current affairs. It's a bit limited, I think. You know, I mean, you wouldn't want a whole evening of it, would you? But I think we should get back to real life now, to the things we see around us every day, like the sky at night, for example. Swan has a song on this very subject, a short song, but nonetheless nauseating.
Well, be that as it may, this song is called My Horoscope. Jupiter's passed through Orion and come into conjunction with Mars. Saturn is wheeling through infinite space to its preordained place in the stars. And I gaze at the planets in wonder at the trouble and time they expend, all to warn me to be careful in dealings involving a friend.
Hello friends, welcome today again to Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, the reigning sexual intellectual, aka an effing know-it-all, Andrew Stewart. Today we are going to be having a very interesting set of interviews that are related to an issue that seems to be quite prominent still in our discourse. The first interview today is with Jeff Perry. He is a professor who has dedicated a significant amount of work and scholarship to the presentation and exhibition of the works of the late Theodore Allen, and particularly his magisterial and extremely important 2-volume work, The Invention of the White Race. So we are going to have his interview first, and then afterwards we're going to throw into it a second interview, syndicating one from many years ago that deals with a counter of sorts to that discussion. Mr. J. Sakai and his book, Settlers, The Myth of the White Proletariat. So stick around and stay tuned. We're going to have an interesting and enlightening show for you. Let's start with contemporary issues and then move backwards. This Trump and Sanders populist uprising expressed this kind of nostalgia for the 1940s to 1950s welfare state. But why exactly is that so problematic?
Well, I'm drawing on the work of Theodore W. Allen, and I have a web page, so whoever's listening, if they care to go to it, they can go to it. It's www.jeffreybperry.net. But and I've done quite a number of talks and written articles on this regarding, for instance, the New Deal, which people talk about or refer to longingly, perhaps. It's important for people to know that every program, every federal program from the New Deal into the 1960s was shaped in a white supremacist fashion. One of the arguments that Allen makes is that white supremacy has been the key to how the ruling class has maintained social control in this country, going back to 17th century Virginia. And his major work is The Invention of the White Race. He talks how this whole system got set up. But if we go back now and we look in the 30s, in the Depression, some examples of what I'm talking about, and the reason so much of the policies of New Deal were shaped in a white supremacist fashion is because FDR's troika of support, his three legs of support, were the urban political machines, the trade unions, but the third group was a really key one. It was the Southern Dixiecrats, the white supremacist Southern Dixiecrats, many of them who are now in the Republican Party, right? And or their ancestors or their descendants, excuse me. So all these policies were shaped. So we look at labor legislation coming out of the New Deal, and you look at things like the Fair Labor Standards Act or the National Labor Relations Act, or even Social Security until 1951. They were written so as to exclude domestic and agricultural workers, which is 75% of your Black and Latin workforce, particularly down south. So they consciously excluded from these programs, right? Another example is relief money. Relief money was federal programs, but then it was to be awarded locally, down in the states. And tremendous disparity in who received what, particularly in the South. The last two issues that I usually point to, I think are very important to understand. One is the GI Bill, which when I talk about the white supremacist shaping of policies, it goes all the way up to 1960. So the GI Bill is in the wake of World War II, and under the GI Bill, families or people who purchase homes, GIs, covered by the bill, could get a house with zero down payment and a low interest loan. And the statistics for New York, New Jersey, where I live, but I think they're probably similar for Providence, for Boston, for every city in this country, statistics for the New York, North Jersey area, 67,000 GI loans were awarded. Less than 100 go to families of color. That's how you get this ring of lily white suburbs that surround so many of our cities. That's how you get the really reinforcement of segregated and residential housing and things like that. And the last statistic I usually point to is the unemployment ratio. Since I was born, I'm born in 1946. Essentially, since that period, the black to white unemployment ratio has been 2 to 1 or some variant of that. And I know the statistics are played with by the government in many ways, but if the white unemployment is 4%, the black unemployment is 8%, 5%, 10%, etc. But it's important for people to understand in 1929, at the start of the Great Depression, the black to white unemployment ratio was 1 to 1, which makes sense if you think about it, because black people, African Americans, brought here to this country to work, and they did work, and they do work, right? But after all those programs of the New Deal and the post-war redeployment, by 1947, the black to white unemployment ratio was 2-to-1, and that's all it's been, or some close variant of that. That's all it's been since then. So it's important to understand, I think, that this white supremacist shaping of so much of our society is consciously done by powerful forces in the ruling elite. It's reinforced in many ways in the media and everything like this. And the reason they do it is because it serves ruling class interests. Working people are not benefiting from this current system. And we see it in so many areas. And when I've written, I've talked about areas like health benefits and, how our healthcare, we're the richest country in the world, but our healthcare system ranks probably around 47 in the world. All the other countries have major national programs, something like a Medicare, or something along those lines, a single payer program of sorts, right? We look at other aspects for workers, questions of benefits in terms of unemployment leave, maternity leave, paternity leave, vacation time, all these areas compared to all the advanced capitalist countries, the U.S. fares far worse. What's most important to keep in mind, I think, and for people active in the labor movement today, people active amongst workers, the gap between rich and poor in the United States is currently the widest it's ever been in history. This is staggering, and we see the extravagance of the current president, right? I mean, he's flying all over and spending money and thinks nothing of dropping these $1 million bombs, $1 million or something. I just shake my head when I look at TV and what's on, what we're presented with. And that's why I think it's very important, particularly for people who want change. We have to look back. We have to learn a little history. And I have some experience doing this. I worked 32 years in the post office. I come out of a big 4,000 worker facility. And when we really started, putting our feet to the ground to take on this work, we tried to do it with the understanding that white supremacy was central to how the ruling class maintains social control in this country. And so every issue we looked at in the workplace, we looked at from a class perspective, how are our workers, how are we all being affected by it? But we looked at every issue to see how was white supremacy also shaping it. And it invariably was, whether it was, in the post office, you're supposed to be protected with some light duty protection if you're injured, particularly pregnant women, but black women being denied light duty work, assignments and things like that. Overtime, people were very hungry for overtime, in particularly in certain periods when there was none and they needed more money just to get along. And the overtime was being distributed in a very white supremacist fashion. So we had to break with that. We had to challenge it. We said, nope, we're not doing this. It's going to be on a rotating basis. It's going to be done fairly. And at first, people would look and they, is this for real? Are you really doing this? And some people are ready to come to blows, some of the white workers, if you will, the European Americans, because they say, oh, you're taking money out of my pocket. But when you put that into practice and you show people that this is for real, it's an injury to one is an injury to all, you start gaining respect, and we built a very fine movement over many years with that policy. And I would recommend for any people doing work in workplaces, be it in the teaching, if you're in the education system, I think it's important to look at, what's going on with the schools. In New York, one of my good friends is looking very active, and it may be this way up where you are also, but there's been over the past couple of decades, percentage-wise, a loss of Black and Latin teachers, right? There's been a whitening of the teacher workforce. It's got to do with all these different programs and policies that are coming in. And that has a negative impact in many ways in terms of the African American community, but in terms of even the students, because oftentimes they don't have these good mentors, people maybe rooted in the community who, be there and spend some time with them, extra time and things like that.
The point that jumps to mind is that it's precisely after the Goldwater-Johnson contest when the uh, boundaries, or the margins, I should say, of the New Deal are being proposed to be expanded to include black and brown people under the auspices of the Great Society, that you begin to see the withdrawal of the welfare state.
Right. And that's when you have, I mean, Alan did a wonderful review of a book by a guy named Kevin Phillips on the emerging Republican majority. He talked about how these voters were moving, right? They're moving, over a period of, a few presidential elections, down south. A lot of these white voters who had been the Dixiecrats move, first there's a little pull from Wallace and stuff like that, but then they move into the Republican Party. And you see that. As the movement heightens, in the 60s, you've got that civil rights, black liberation struggle, and it's a catalyst for so many efforts at social change. The anti-war movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, gay and lesbian rights. Every movement is taking sustenance from the civil rights, black liberation struggle, because two main reasons, I think, because the cause is just, and because it hits so directly at how the ruling class maintains control. So, of course, they respond with their policies, and their policies are really geared and target at the African American community, and they take out a lot of the prominent black leaders, and maybe the less prominent, but the up and coming black leaders also. And his programs, in terms of drugs, being brought into communities and things like this, they're all very systematic. And we, those of us who are struggling today, we really have to even dig deeper and get beyond a lot of what is put forth as the explanations for things happen, because there's a lot more organized effort to do some of these things. One thing I'll just mention, too, if people get a chance, if they go to my webpage, Hubert Harrison, the other person I write about, who's the father of Harlem radicalism, had a young grandson named Ray Richardson, who was a film major graduate student at Boston University when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968. And public broadcasting was looking, they had no black programming at all virtually, so they went quickly and they tried to, do something. And they got Ray Richardson and some of his cohorts to do a black programming show in Boston called Say Brother. It had tremendous appeal. It was Thursday night for an hour, replayed on the weekend, and it was political. It had entertainment. It had cultural speakers and events, and great mass appeal. And then what happened? I've written an article on this with Ray Richardson's brother. I'm going to end this real quickly now, but what happens is New Bedford, Mass. erupts in some rebellion in 1970 after some incidents of police brutality. And the Say Brothers crew takes the cameras, the TV cameras, into the community for 6 days, and they give voice to the community. We don't see this nowadays. And public broadcasting's going crazy, and their sponsors, they demand the show be taken off the air and Ray Richardson gets fired. To make the story short now, Ray Richardson is fired. The show's taken off the air. It comes back after he's gone, right? He goes down to Mexico to visit his father, who had been a Tuskegee Airman, was now living in Mexico. And on the way back, he and his fiancée, a woman named Vashti Lowndes, who's also a very talented TV person, die under super suspicious conditions, allegedly from drowning in Mexico. This is in early January 1971. And when I was researching the article, and I mention this because some of these places are a little familiar to people, the Boston Globe ran an article on Ray Richardson's death, his suspicious death from drowning in 1971. And right below it, there was another article on the death of Jacobo Arbenz. People may or may not be familiar with Arbenz, but he was the president of Guatemala, duly elected and progressive, and he ousted United Fruit, and then the United States removed him in an openly declared CIA coup, right? They removed him, and he went and was in Cuba for a while, and he was in Mexico. And virtually the same day that Ray Richardson allegedly drowned in Mexico from, allegedly died in Mexico from drowning, Jacobo Arbenz dies in Mexico from drowning also. And as the Globe reports, his drowning was in his own bathtub. Yeah, so this is the period. I'm saying this to point. This is the period when black leaders, black activists at all levels were being taken out. And sorry again if I went off on that, but the article is on Ray Richardson. People can find it online. Black Agenda Report, Counterpunch, a number of places carried it.
Right. So let's go back to the very beginning and where Alan's work really starts with in terms of the invention of the white race. How's it all begin?
Okay, well, Alan spent 30 some odd years working on this. This was his life work. And by the way, Alan himself is a former coal miner. He's an autodidact, as is Hubert Harrison, the other person I write about. And Alan taught for many years at the Jefferson School in New York. He taught political economics. He didn't have any college degree or anything like that, but this was a radical Communist Party-related school. He left the Communist Party in the 50s, and he starts figuring things out anew on his own. And around 1965, he pioneers white skin privilege analysis. Now, people today hear about white privilege, and if you go online to Wikipedia, they'll tell you it starts around 1986 and Peggy McIntosh and this and that. And the first line is white privilege theory maintains that all white people benefit from white privileges. But that's not Alan's analysis at all. Alan's analysis in his early writings in 1965 was that these white privileges were a poison bait for European American workers, for white workers, if you will. That the people who benefit are the white ruling elite, but working people, black and white, do not benefit from this system of privileges. And so, and he develops that analysis, and he does a number of very influential pieces that impacted my generation when I'm growing up. And by 1969, the New York Times was running a front page article on how the National Office of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, had committed to waging an all-out war against white skin privilege. So there's a much deeper history, and people should look into that. And again, if they go to my webpage, they'll find some of Alan's writings. But what happened is Alan was developing that work, and he was developing another longer piece in which he was looking at U.S. history. And he was trying to explain why we couldn't get closer to socialism or progressive social change in this country. And he started looking at all the left and labor explanations for the relatively low level of class consciousness in the U.S. compared to other advanced capitalist countries. Other countries have significant socialist parties, labor parties, communist parties, and we've always, for the most part, been far away from that. And he went through all the rationales, the heterogeneity of the workforce, the free land safety valve. It was a list of about 6 that he goes through. And again, I detail all this in what I've written. And then he examines each one, and he says each one is more myth than reality, and the real key is white supremacy and the system of white privileges. That's been the main retardant to class consciousness, particularly amongst the European American workers. They put race first before class. So he's developing that analysis, and a guy named Winthrop Jordan comes out with a book in 1968. And Jordan, I think, at that time might be teaching down at the University of Mississippi. He winds up there anyway, I think. And his book is White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, and put some years on it, 1550 to, can't recall right now, 1818, some such. And Jordan, you can tell by the title, he's equating white with American, white over black, right? And the essence of Jordan's book, or one of the key points he makes, is that racism is an unthinking decision. And once that book comes out, that is used as an ideological counter to all those civil rights, black liberation struggles of the 60s. And it's basically saying, and this wins national book awards and things like that, right? And it's basically saying, racism's innate. So the implications of that are that if racism's innate, why fight it? You can't do anything about it. So Alan decides to set out to go back to the 17th century, because Jordan's writing about the colonial period in particular. He has to counter Jordan. And in the process, he undertakes to challenge 2 main theses. And these 2 main theses, Alan believed, and I believe, are the 2 main arguments that undermine struggle against white supremacy amongst European American workers. One is the argument that white workers benefit from racism, because if they benefit, why should they fight it? And the second argument is that racism is innate, because if it's innate, why fight it? You can't change it, right? So these are the arguments that Allen's going to go after. So he goes back and he engages in what I refer to as good proletarian scholarship. He's not looking for a degree. He's looking for answers. He's looking for explanations. And he's tireless in his research. And I've got all his materials here. We're looking to place them at a major repository currently. But Allen focuses on 17th century Virginia. Along the way, but he points out that the way social controls maintained in the Anglo-American continental colonies, that's the U.S., what we now refer to as the South of the U.S., is different than how it's maintained in the Caribbean, where Harrison comes from, or Jamaica, where Marcus Garvey and Claude McKay and people come from. We can get into that later if you want. But so Allen is writing about, he understands England is capitalist, and England, when they start coming to Virginia in the early 1600s, it's to be set up they're looking to set it up in some capitalist way. But Virginia is where the main settlement is at first down south, and the Powhatan, the Native Americans in the area, are not a very hierarchical society. The British, if they had some desire to come in and try and just work them like the Spanish had done in Peru or in Mexico, there was not going to happen, because the Powhatan at first had the preponderance of power, but they got away. They could easily escape. They had a vast continent at their back, so they weren't going to be forced into very much labor. And so in Virginia, the colonies going along at a little bit of a half-speed rate until mid-16 teens, when they turn to tobacco production. And all of a sudden, there's a chance to make some significant profit by tobacco production. There's great interest in England for it, and they start developing some plantations down there. But the laborers in Virginia in this period have what's referred to as the rights of Englishmen. And Allen discusses this because in England there had been some struggle. Back in the mid 1500s, as England's coming out of feudalism and there's, development of capitalism in England, there had been some efforts in England to enslave English laboring people, vagabonds and vagrants and the like. And there was actually legislation for about a 3-year period, but struggle by working people beat that back. England also, for those who are not familiar with it, there was regarding Scotland, there was also slavery for a period of almost 200 years, from the early 1600s to the late 1790s. So it's important to know little nuggets like that, because people don't think that these rulers would enslave people of their own phenotype, of their own skin color, but they're cutthroat. They'll do what they can get away with, right? So what happens in Virginia is, as they start on plantation production, they start looking for ways to, reduce labor costs, because a lot of the labor relations at first are on a capitalist basis. Their laborers are oftentimes tenants at half. They work the land and they produce, and they give half to the person who owns the property and they keep half. And there's wage laborers, and they experiment with some various, intermediary forms. But the major qualitative change happens in 1622, in March of 1622, and what happens is the Powhatan Indians in the area of Jamestown rise up, and they kill 1/3 of the colonists in one day. And within the next year, they kill another third. So that meant that for those in the Virginia colony, they were basically limited to the confines of the fort, and the very nearby surroundings, because to go out higher, with corn was the main crop that people would eat, right? And that growing high there was risk of coming under attack. So the laboring population was extremely vulnerable in this condition because the people who controlled the magazine, the supplies, right, had them in this very vulnerable position. It's what Naomi Klein might refer to as a ripe situation for a shock doctrine. And in Virginia, what happens is the ruling elite, starting in 1622, start imposing a new category of labor on these laboring people in Virginia. It is chattel bond servitude. By chattel, that means they're treated as property, right? And you start seeing it in the laws and in the legislation, and there's reference to, well, this person could be sold to this one and that one. And the chattel bond servitude was for, oftentimes the length of service would be 4 or 5 years. Sometimes when they had vulnerable groups, they try and extend it to 6 or 7. But chattel bond servitude became the predominant form of labor in plantation Virginia. And people should understand Virginia was the pattern-setting plantation colony. 7 of the first 12 presidents come from Virginia. So as they start developing their plantation system based on chattel bond labor. Now, the first Africans had come in 1619, but when they arrived in Virginia, there was no slavery in Virginia. And whatever their status was on the high seas, when they got to Virginia, they weren't enslaved because there was no slavery. Very quickly, probably virtually all of them would become chattel bond laborers like the majority of the European laborers. What Allen points out, and this is a staggering statistic, and I don't have it right in front of me, but as best I recall, up until 1692, 3/4 of the European laborers who came to Virginia were chattel bond servants. Now, think about that, and please, I hope your audience listens, because when I grew up in school, we'd be taught that there were Negro slaves and white indentured servants. Now, what's very important is the word white doesn't appear in a Virginia colonial record till 1691. I'm going to get into that in a second. So they weren't white. They were English, they were Dutch, they were Scotch, whatever. So, and they weren't indentured. A few had indentures, some had indentures, but the overwhelming majority had chattel bondage imposed in Virginia, where it was referred to as the custom of the country. An indenture is a contract, a written contract somebody signs. That wasn't what was being done. People were being treated like chattel. So under these conditions in Virginia, there was much similarity of suffering between European Americans and African Americans, but there was much commonality of experience too, and there was much solidarity. And again, not only did the word white not appear, but the white race as we know it wasn't functioning. People did what normal people do. They worked together, they ran away together, they made love together, they functioned like normal human beings. And in 1660, the price of tobacco on the market went down, and over the next 16 years or so, I think there were about 12 laboring class and bond servant rebellions of various sorts. The big one was Bacon's Rebellion of 1676, 77, he went into early 77. And in Bacon's Rebellion, the second stage is the key stage. It starts out as a struggle between the elite and the sub-elite over the rate of expropriating land from the Native Americans. But in the Civil War stage, the second stage, the people at the bottom start rising up and demanding their freedom from bondage. And as they do this, they kick out the governor, they burn Jamestown, the capital, and they control 6/7 of the colony for 9 months. So what becomes the key issue is social control. And what's very interesting about Allen's 2-volume work on the invention of the white race, the first volume is the invention of the white race, racial oppression and social control. And so you see the title is right there. Yeah, it's right there in the title, social control. He's always looking. Allen's very clear that the ruling elite has 2 primary tasks, particularly under capitalism. They want to make profits, but they have to maintain social control. So getting back with the story. So what happens, Bacon's Rebellion is eventually put down. Some of the accounts are fascinating to read because they talk about, in the final stages, one of the ship captains sent to put down the insurrection, talks about encountering 400 Negroes and Europeans in arms, and some were for cutting me to pieces and shooting me and things like this. But what's interesting is Negroes and Europeans. They're still not white, right? And in the final stages, there were these holdouts, again, Negroes and Europeans who wouldn't give up their arms. And so that was kind of a high point of a social struggle in 17th century Virginia. And Allen describes how in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling class sets about to maintain system of social control by a new system of racial oppression that would be, and what the key to it would be the system of white race privileges. And he talks about how over the next period of time, from the wake of Bacon's Rebellion into the 1720s in particular, that whole stretch, lots of legislation is passed which extend all kinds of racial privileges to the Europeans, the European American laborers, take privileges away from the African Americans, and they codified some of these laws in 1705 and again in 1723. And what's very interesting is it's not simply that they go after the laboring people, the bond servants. They go after free African Americans too, because there were free African Americans. And in 1723, they pass a law which, amongst other things, it's taking away the right to bear arms, but it also takes away the right to vote for Negroes who owned property. And I mean, that was the general qualification for anybody to vote in Virginia. You had to have property, certain amount of property. And African Americans had been voting for over 80 years in Virginia. And again, people don't know that. We're kind of under the impression, there's slavery from the beginning, and that's all there was. Allen makes very clear it wasn't like that. The status of African Americans for most of the 17th century in Virginia was indeterminate. It was being struggled out. But this codification of laws in 1723 takes away the right to vote of African Americans. And even in England, they don't understand. They say, well, you're taking the right to vote if these people, own property, own land, And the governor, a fellow named Gooch, writes to them and says, we did it to fix a perpetual brand on free Negroes and mulattoes. So, it's evidence of a very clear ruling class policy. And what's important, I think, in understanding that is it's kind of the flip side of, when we talk about white privileges, there are sometimes white privileges conferred upon European Americans. That's what Allen, he goes through a whole list of different things in the late 17th century. But there's also the extra punishments and disabilities placed on African Americans, right? And that's kind of the flip side of white identity. It's to, kind of encourage this notion, well, we're white, that's not us, and things like that. So Allen, this is what Allen develops, over the course of these years. Now, in this book, his invention, he has three main theses, and I just like to go over these with people so they hear it at least once. And this is on his theses on the invention of the white race, which is, again, as I said, the word doesn't appear until 1691, and the white race, as we know it, was not functioning, right? And his three main theses are these. One, the white race was invented as a ruling class social control formation in response to labor solidarity as manifested in the latter Civil War stages of Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 and 1677. Two, a system of racial privileges was deliberately instituted by the late 17th, early 18th century Anglo-American bourgeoisie in order to define and establish the white race and establish a system of racial oppression. And he defines racial oppression elsewhere. He has some characteristics of it. And three, the consequence of this system of racial oppression and white privileges was not only ruinous to the interest of the African Americans, but it was also disastrous for European American workers. Their position, the European Americans, vis-a-vis the rich and powerful, was not improved, but weakened by the white skin privilege system. And in much of his work, Allen talks, and Allen comes from, West Virginia, Kentucky, that region, in his youth, right? That's where he's growing up. So he's familiar with a lot of this, and he will often talk and cite statistics to show how the gap, how the European American workers fare worse down south than any place else in the country, where the white supremacy is most pronounced. Most people consider it to be most pronounced. They fare worse. So, but people have been, he also talks about in his work how, as they were setting up the system of white race privileges, people were indoctrinated in the system. Back then, the main means of mass communication were putting posters on the church doors or the courtroom doors and reading them aloud to people. But this is how they, it's their form of mass media back then. And this is how the word got out, and people were told, and constantly being told, it's in your interest, it's in your benefit, and it's not. And that's one of the key things I think it's important for people doing work amongst working class people to understand, that a system of racial privileges and of disparate treatment, attacking African Americans stuff, that is not in our interest. What's in our interest is that we stand together, that we're treated as equal. An injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity forever means privileges never. There's all kinds of slogans we can put together around this, but that's the way I think working people have to struggle. And when we talk about what's going on today, of course, Trump's appeal, and we know he doesn't get the majority of workers, but he does get enough electoral colleges in those gerrymandered districts all around the country. And this is all part of, the white supremacy working and how they set up these congressional districts and everything else. And Allen goes into this, and he talks about how from way back, it was the Southern plantation elite that was shaping so much of the policy. And he talks about even after the Civil War, how the ruling elite in this country adopts the social control system of the South and really nationalizes it in terms of their immigration policy, industrial employment policy, and things like that.
This is a little...
I wanted to say something about Bernie Sanders, right?
Right.
This is just from my distance, and I just, there were a couple of issues I would have liked to see Sanders be much stronger on, and the most important one, of course, was the question of white supremacy and all of this, and really offer some major clarity on it. Now, if he did, I did not hear it or see it in any way, and I think it's just crucial. I think we're not going to get very far if we don't have a movement that understands that, because when we're understanding that and challenging it and building a movement around that, I'm talking about a movement with working people, right? Then we're doing two things. We're really getting this really advanced element of the working class. Black workers have played such a signal role historically in terms of labor in this country, when people take a deep, true look at it. But also, we cut through a lot of the things that people are constantly taught and fed, and we can, we get European American workers to take those steps to break away from the white supremacy, to fight it, to challenge it, to show solidarity. Then we build that. Then we're building a really strong movement, and we can start dictating some policy. But I think we're unfortunately still far from that, here in this country.
Right. Now, this is on the more academic side, but Cedric Robinson, in his book Black Marxism, says that racism is inherent to the very foundations of European culture and goes back to antiquity. Have you ever dealt with his text?
Well, a little bit. He writes Black Marxism also, right? And one thing I'm just going to get this in before I get to what you're really asking, but that book work, which a lot of people cite, doesn't mention Hubert Harrison once.
Mm-hmm.
Hubert Harrison's father of Harlem radicalism, the major influence on Randolph and Garvey. He's a giant of that. That's the other person I write about. Not mentioned once, right? I just shake my head in disbelief at that concept. Now, on what he says there, well, Allen goes into, and that's why I like Harrison and Allen, two people I write about. Allen goes back and he tries to take on some of these arguments, like what you're attributing here, what you're saying, Robinson's saying, and he tries to show that Europeans, his whole first volume, Allen's whole first volume, not whole, but much of it focuses on the English treatment of the Irish, people of the same phenotype, and how this is a form of racial oppression, right? And what Allen wants to do is, he says, to really understand racial oppression, you have to look at the nature of oppression and get beyond the skin color. And he talks about all these characteristics and the vicious treatment of the Irish for centuries by the English. He also talks about how in other periods, in the periods in the 1500s and stuff, there were elements in English and Spanish society who had very different perspectives on Africans, than what what we're generally fed and stuff. So, and a couple of other things that Allen says in his work is when he's talking about some of the English oppression of the Irish in the early period, going way back in the 12 and 1300s, he's talking about it having the characteristics of what he would call racial oppression. And that is pre-capitalist. So it's not simply that you need capitalism to have racial oppression. And Allen also goes into some big discussions on what is meant by race, how we're defining race. So let's come back. And what are you saying? Robinson says that you...
Well, yeah, Robinson's text argues that slavery is the basis of the creation of capitalism, which he calls racial capitalism. But he says that the very foundations of European culture in antiquity are racist by design. And African culture is, I'm perhaps misusing the word, the antithesis of European culture in this sense.
Well, all right. I mean, I don't know that I can really go into all that. My understanding is that European culture was not so monolithic.
Okay.
Certainly. I don't know that I have so much to say. And slavery, well, again, in Virginia, the plantation system was built through much of the 17th century on chattel bond labor.
Right.
It's not white slavery, right? So I think a much more, less sweeping global statements and a much more, let's examine the particulars, right? I think if we examine the particulars, we probably get a different, understanding of what went on in Virginia. And I guess if we examine the particulars, maybe we'll understand the importance of Hubert Harrison more. I mean, that's some of my thoughts on that. But go on, I'm sorry.
Well, here's a more practical question. You mentioned the Irish, and in my own experience, I've encountered people, if you talk about white privilege, and they say, oh, well, my family came over from Ireland or Italy, or, some were part of some ethnic enclave that was not part of Yankee civilization in America, and that is supposed to erode the concept of them having white privilege. Do you have any experience working in that kind of discourse or discussion with people?
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, my own family, I'll start with that. My mom's one of 10 children, her mother's one of 10 children, the father's one of 10 children, the roots, and part of my family goes back to Ireland. Other, Slavic, that's where the derivation of the word slave come from. Nobody in my family ever went to college. My people are all working people, so I understand that. I understand that people do have roots, working class, history of oppression, and all of that. And I think, though, in the U.S., as they're here, the system of racial privileges is in place and conferred, oftentimes in so many situations. And that's the process of people who, some people describe it as people who weren't, quote, white before becoming white, different groups and things like that. But and Alan talks about that in terms of the Irish. But what he points out in terms of the Irish becoming white, it's not so much on their own initiative, because the Irish were opponents of the British. They supported abolition. They opposed slavery. But after coming in the 1840s, 50s, within a couple generations, there's what Alan calls a sea change. And they support slavery and they oppose abolition, not all, but in numbers. But he talks about the influences and how this is done. And he talks about the ruling elite and the plantation ruling elite, their ties to financial interest in New York, where many of the Irish came, and Mayor Fernando Wood. He talks about the role of Tammany Hall and and the Catholic Church hierarchy. It's these forces that disseminate information and analysis and understanding, and dispense privileges, in the patronage systems in all the various ways. So this goes on. I think, I've written things, but I think if we look at any avenue of society, any aspect of U.S. society today, we look at unemployment, we can look at the statistics, we look at wage differentials, we can look at the statistics, we look at life expectancy, we look at educational attainment. All these areas we can see where whites are faring better than blacks, or higher levels, right? But the question is this disparity and this, is this in people's interest? It's not in their interest. What's in their interest, particularly for working people, is that we're all getting the best education policy possible. That we're in all these areas, we're working together to get better. Again, I just came in before to talk, but I have statistics that I've used showing, numbers and the number of people close to the level of poverty, in poverty, on the verge of poverty, how this is increasing. All these statistics are there if people dig, if they dig with the eye to look. I think it's important, particularly for people of your generation, I would say, you just with a critical eye, look at each one of these issues and see how is white supremacy shaping it, but do it with the understanding that white supremacy is not innate. The people don't have to think and act this way; they can change. Alan's work. He writes in the beginning how he thinks it's important to challenge white identity. He argues there's nothing positive in white identity. And that's a big step. Now people are clinging to that, but then you have to go back and look, well, what is white identity? Where does this white race come from? When does it start? Now, that's it. Right now.
Certainly. Do you have any practical advice for organizing and activism around this sort of effort that you haven't discussed previously?
Well, I did some articles way back at labor notes conferences and troublemaker handbooks, and I've got a number of things I wrote. Many things I wrote years ago. But again, I think just the key. When I worked in a 4,000 worker bulk mail facility, it became a hotbed of activism, labor activism in the 70s and 80s. And one thing we did, and I think this is very important, I've talked about understanding the two main arguments that undermine the struggle against white supremacy, that racism is innate and that white privileges and white supremacy is in white workers' interests. It's not, right? Those two things. I think it's important to have that. I think it's important to look, as I've said, at every issue and see how is white supremacy shaping this and what can we do to challenge that? How are we going to deal with this, right? You don't look the other way. You got to deal with it. You got to confront it. Now, another thing that I think is very important and we try to do is, back then when I was working, it's a lot easier nowadays in this era of computers, but we used to work in the post office and payday was every second Thursday. Every 2 Thursdays was payday. So you kind of knew on Thursday you'd have the most people coming to work, right? In general, right? It was payday. And we would put out bulletins, weekly bulletins. These were mimeos and things like that back then, every Thursday. and people came to look on it for insight and answers and what's going on. And it'd be read all throughout the cafeteria and on the workroom floor and things like that. And I really came to appreciate and understand that regularity and consistency was very important. There were some, activists in my, back then in that period who functioned under the slogan, and this is not to mischaracterize and, take cheap shit, but under the slogan, a single spark can start a prairie fire, right? And they would spring into action whenever there was an incident, but then there'd be a big lapse in between, right? And I think you want to build steady work. Then you can also respond very significantly when there's that key incident or something like that. But I think that's another thing I would suggest. Also, what we did at the post office and in the community, this was Jersey City, New Jersey, but we in our union, in our committees, we'd have workers, we'd have grievance committees, we'd have women's committees, health and safety committees, stewards apparatus. Take careful looks at all of them. Examine what's the makeup, what's the racial and gender makeup of these bodies, right? And how is that what we want? Do we want to move it in a much more progressive direction, which we did. We had we made major steps in that direction, because it brings a lot more people in, a lot more good people with good analysis if you don't settle into some of those old ways. So I think that was an important thing. I think particularly around the question of race, European Americans have much to learn, so they should pay attention, right? But I think it's also, Hubert Harrison, one of the people I write about, writes, he was writing in the Socialist Press around 1911, 1912, and he did series, one of the first major series by a black socialist in the party press. And he was, at one point, he tries to give some little simple advice to some of his comrades in the Socialist Party, and they ask him, well, how should we treat the black worker or something like that? And Harrison says, well, to begin with, treat him as a normal human being. It's so basic, but just the outward interact with people, talk, communicate with each other. We would have, again, this was a big workplace, 4,000 workers. And as you might imagine, oftentimes at lunchtime, people want to sit with friends, people they're comfortable with, and there'll be, groupings. But then people also get away for breaks in between, and there might be just a couple here, a couple there. And it's an opportunity for people to go and, talk to some other people, bring some people to talk, with different people. Good activists can do these things. Another thing for activists today, I would think that something that we did, this is just basic stuff, I guess, but, a big workplace, but then we extended it to our union. We would map our workplace. We would identify all the pay locations, who were our key contacts in them, who was the next rung of people we wanted to try and reach, most specifically, and we'd kind of work out, from concentric circles, and similarly within our local, which branches might be ones that we want to, we want to kind of identify key people in all the branches, and how can we start, developing better relations with other branches and things like that. So, just to planning, strategic planning, just don't let things happen, try and always be analyzing and trying to address it, but understanding. I think it's crucial to understand that, it's a capitalist society. The ruling elite runs it in their interest. White supremacy is key to social control. I think also for your generation in particular, but for people today, we have to take a careful look at the media. We got to take a careful look even at the nonprofits, and see who's funding what and what lines are being put forth and things like that. Got to try and develop some real, independent thinking, putting laboring anti-white supremacist thinking in particular, to the fore. Some thoughts. That's some of my thoughts.
Okay. Do you have any points in conclusion that you would like to bring up?
I would like to encourage people, if they get a chance, because as I said, I came in from, I was out running errands, walked the dog, and I just came here with, and I'm pulling things off. When I ordinarily do these, I'll have a few, documents in front of me with concrete statistics and stuff, so please forgive that. But I want to encourage people, if they will, go to my webpage, www.jeffreybperry.net. On that webpage, right on the front page, you'll find a video on Alan's invention of the white race, which goes through with slides and in much more detail, much more precision and accuracy, some of the things I was talking about today. Up top on that page, you will see an article, The Developing Conjuncture, and some insights from Hubert Harrison and Theodore W. Allen on the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. It's a long article. It started out as a short piece for a publication called Daedalus. I explain what happened in the addendum, but it goes through a lot of important insights from Harrison on Allen on this topic. I have a statistical section of about 12 pages. This was done a few years ago, but the statistics are still relevant, which I think reinforce a lot of these points that I was making. And the article offers the fullest development of the treatment of Allen's thought and how he moves, just from he's got the anti-capitalist analysis, he's a trade unionist, and then how he moves into understanding this white privilege thing, the retarding nature of white supremacy to U.S. society, why it's so key to why there's no socialism. And then he takes it a step further to going back to the origin and, developing that analysis of white supremacy. So on my webpage, there is all that. There's also some very interesting stuff on Hubert Harrison, but also I have a whole page that with links of some of Allen's writings and more short and long videos and audios. And they include topics such as the census and what the government is doing with the census and the Latino category. People might find that of great interest. Another Allen article on affirmative action. Allen has written a 2-volume summary of his argument of the invention of the white race, which is up there online for the shorter version, because his 2-volume work, I encourage people to read it, but it takes work. But if you're serious about wanting to fight white supremacy and stuff, I think it's key. I think it's essential work. Allen also has a short pamphlet on class struggle and the origin of racial slavery, the invention of the white race. A couple of things I want to point out also. Allen, in his subtitle to his books, uses the word origin, not origins, and he explains why. Because he sees the origin of racial oppression and of the invention of the white race. The origin he sees in class struggle. It is class struggle and the ruling class response to that class struggle that leads to what we have. So he's analyzing. All Allen's analysis is coming from a class struggle and a class perspective of looking at how working people are faring under conditions and how they struggle against it, how the ruling class responds. And again, I think it's key for working people.
Kivole Houston, you are listening to Sexto Sol, a weekly program on Chicano Latino issues, and I'm your host, Ernesto Aguilar. This show tonight has generated a lot of interest all over the United States, and for good reason. Our guest sits down for his first ever radio interview with us this evening. Our guest, of course, is Jay Sakai, who wrote a book in the 1980s called Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat. Sakai takes apart U.S. history, examining the development of the U.S. and the white working class, as well as oppressed nationalities, especially Mexicanos, Africans, Native nations, and Asians. He tears down popular lies about history and posts many, many fresh perspectives for revolutionaries of color. And I'd like to welcome Jay Sakai on the program tonight. Mr. Sakai, you there?
Okay. Hey.
How are you doing?
Well, okay.
It's a real honor to have you on the program. I got to be honest with you. I've been a reader of many, many of your writings, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful honor to have you on the program tonight. And you laugh.
Oh, hey, that sounds good. Okay.
Okay, well, I definitely want to kick right into it. Normally, the people who have heard the show before will know I normally play a little bit of music before I bring on a guest, but because this interview is the way that it is, I definitely wanted to jump right into a few questions that I had for you. Now, as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, in the early 80s, you wrote Settlers. It was a book that I think took a deep historical look at the role of white workers and the lives and the histories of oppressed people. Now, can you break down for listeners what inspired you to write the book Settlers and some of the ideas or the most important ideas that you think you put forward in that book?
Well, I wrote it because at that time, and we're talking about the mid-'70s that I started working on it, it seemed to me that, like, every time there was, a struggle or an outbreak of something or an act of injustice happened, racism, there always more and more calls to study people of color. There are more books piling up about us. We're getting funded to do things, But actually, we're not the problem.
Excellent.
The problem is white people. So I said, well, what about them? The other thing, of course, is the time I was working in an auto parts plant. And as a revolutionary, I'd been taught all this stuff about class unity and how, white workers and workers of color were going to unite everything, except in real life, I didn't actually see that. What I saw was there were some good guys who were white, to be sure, but basically the white guys were pretty reactionary, and they were always selling us out. So I was trying to figure out, where did racism in the white working class actually begin? I mean, was there a point where, they started selling out or got misled or something?
And where did that lead you?
Well, that led me all the way back to Plymouth Rock, actually.
Whoa.
Because I kept, I'm not a historian. I wasn't then. And I started reading, and I figured, well, maybe it happened in the 1930s, before we were born, or, maybe the 1920s, going back and back. And it was like treading water. I never found ground. Finally, I figured out that actually there wasn't any time when the white working class wasn't white supremacist and racist and essentially pro-empire. So I couldn't figure out, well, how did this happen? That's when this whole idea came to me, which isn't my idea. But at the time, I knew a lot of African revolutionaries in exile from Zimbabwe and South Africa, whose people were doing guerrilla wars, against the colonial powers.
Right.
And so they were always talking about white people, but they didn't really mean race. They kept using the term settlers. And they kept talking about settler colonialism. Then I ran into some Palestinians, and they talked about the Israelis that way, that it was settler colonialism, i.e. that European populations had been imported into these countries to act as the agents for capitalism and for the ruling classes. And at that point, of course, the light bulb went on over my head. I said, my God, that describes America. I don't know why I was so dumb I didn't figure that out. But so that's kind of the central idea in the book Settlers, that the U.S. really isn't like a society in which there's different races and we're trying to get along. That may be true on the surface. But it's in its actual history, it's an empire of imported European settlers who always were given special privileges to be the occupation army over all the rest of us. That I can't say that made my book popular, but it certainly raised a lot of controversy at the time.
Do you think that some of the historical points that you brought out in the book originally, as you just mentioned, were the most important points that you brought out? Because I think, especially when you look at revolutionary literature, particularly anti-imperialist literature, over the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years even, you don't see that point brought out as clearly as it was in Settlers in a lot of respects. I mean, there were a lot of points in literature in which that is being brought out, but I think that Settlers put it in a way that really crystallized it for a lot of people.
Well, in part because it was written at a juncture, a point in history, where we were going through all these intense struggles, in the 60s and 70s. And actually, my feeling, and I think a lot of people's feeling then was, well, we waited 400 years for the unity. So if it can't come in 400 years, then how long are we supposed to wait for this stuff? How real is it? Why don't we look at this idea instead of just taking it as a given? I mean, and I got to tell you that even in integrated stuff, the difference between different peoples really meant a lot back then. And it's one of the things I always tell young people I know who are, starting to learn about stuff, and that is that don't believe all the stuff you read in the history books and you see on television, stuff like that, because a lot of it's not true.
Indeed, it isn't. I want to definitely put this in a context for listeners who've heard the show before. When we talk about land and the settlement of land, one of the things we talked about on the show was that the Mexican land was settled in the early 1800s, and it resulted in the U.S. seizing over half of Mexico's land around 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the places we know as Texas, Califas, Arizona, and many of the other states in the Southwest were actually ancestrally held by the Mexicans and became part of the United States as part of a forcible campaign to take that land. A lot of people, that's not really taught in history books in a lot of respects. How can you explain to people in very clear terms how the American West was settled, and how does that differ from the popular conceptions you were just mentioning about history? The examples I can think off the top of my head, cowboys and this rugged individualism and all these other things, people coming and settling the land that was just here, and buffalo dancing around happy and ready for the taking.
Well, that's the whole thing, The whole mythology of the West and the Southwest is that all this land was empty, and that Europeans came and they filled the land, because there was hardly anybody there before. And if they were there, they kind of weren't too important because just a few people, and they didn't know what they were doing. They were wandering around in the sun, kind of stuff. No idea that actually these are whole other nations, whole other societies. And the settler invasion, powered by immigration from Europe and the development of capitalist armies and, mechanization and industrialization, completely, over the course of centuries, overwhelmed all these other societies on the continent. The United States is a unique nation because it's always been an empire. It's never just been a nation of ordinary people. From its very beginnings, it's been an illegitimate nation in the sense that in order to become a nation, it had to conquer other people, take their land, and enslave them. There literally has been no point in American history where that wasn't true, because that's the basis of what being American is, which is, of course, the whole problem in the social character of the question of justice here.
Certainly.
So you see these struggles going on. I mean, I remember in the 1960s when Rees Tijerina and the Alliance was fighting on the Spanish land grant question in the Southwest. A lot of people had no idea that these grants had ever even existed, or that, in fact, legal title to much of the land in the Southwest was held, and still is held, by Mexican families and Chicano families. That this land was never, ever legally part of the United States in terms of being owned by white business interests. This land was all stolen at gunpoint. And time after time, Rees and his people would hold meetings. They produced documents, records from Mexico City and stuff like this, proving all these things. So this whole illusion that the Southwest, for example, was not populated, and they just expanded into it, filling the empty space with shopping malls and, factories and whatever they did. That's just nonsense. This is just conquest. I mean, it's no different than Japan invading China in the 1930s, or, any other conquest of empire.
Indeed.
So that produces a peculiar dynamic inside America, because this is a country where the various citizens, the various parts of the population, actually their fundamental relationship was formed by war, not by peace. And of course, that still echoes into our lives today.
And I think that one of the important points that you mentioned in regard to Urestiarina's work around the land grant issue, one of the things that he brought out and he really exposed to a lot of Mexicanos was that a lot of these land grants and a lot of these treaties that had been made to ensure land grants that these families would have henceforth were violated. Not that it's a much of a revolutionary concept for anybody, student of history, to see that the United States violates land grants and violates treaties, but I think it exposed to, particularly to the 60s generation, to a lot of young Chicanos and Chicanas, that the U.S. doesn't very often honor these kinds of treaties and these grants at all, in a lot of respects. Jay, I know we're breaking off into a lot of issues, particularly of colonization and the settling land. Can you explain to people the difference? This is where the juncture for a lot of people breaks to in a lot of respects, meaning that a lot of people assume that this is an issue of racism or an issue of white supremacy purely. Can you explain to people what settlerism is and how that differs from racism or how that differs from white supremacy, just so they understand exactly what that means?
Well, that's a good question. And certainly racism is a phenomena that's worldwide. You have it in Japan and France and Russia and so forth. But what's different here and in countries like Canada, Israel, other places, South Africa, formerly, etc., is that the European population is not indigenous. The European population actually was imported as part of the process of colonialization to be an army of occupation over the conquered territories and peoples. And that's formed the essential character of the United States as a settler country. So that the question isn't just racism. The question is national divisions between people. For example, the question of self-determination for all colonized peoples always is at the heart of political matters. Because I think a lot of people, during the 60s, there was a lot of revolutionary nationalism. People talked about liberating Aztlán, the whole Southwest. A black revolutionary nationalist talked about liberating a black nation in the historically black majority South, the 5 states of the Black Belt. And of course, Indian activists talked about their native lands. A lot of people didn't understand kind of what this was about and viewed this as kind of, almost like legal questions of, are you entitled to this territory or that territory? Well, basically it isn't a legal question. It's a question of self-determination. The essence of decolonialization is really simple. The oppressor can't decide for the oppressed. Well, in America, that means that the white majority has no right to decide for the oppressed. I mean, how, for example, could that ever be just? It's true maybe they could have the majority of votes under their system. But I think that only Mexican people, indigenous people, Chicanos, various Native American peoples, have the right to decide the destiny of the Southwest because that's theirs. I don't think white people have any vote in it at all. Not because I think there's something wrong with them as a race. It's just like, but frankly, the oppressors have no vote in deciding what the oppressed do with their society and their lives. And that's the most simplest kind of understanding of decolonialization you can have, but it's essential. So that the the revolutionary nationalism that a lot of people in the 60s talked about gets confused when people look at it today. But it's all really about self-determination for oppressed people.
I think it's important what you just mentioned a little while back about the growth of the Chicano movement in the 60s and the understanding and the consciousness around Aztlán and around nationalism itself, particularly as it relates to raza. One of the criticisms that I've heard from white theorists is this. Although Chicanos identify as opposing the miseducation and genocide unleashed by the colonizing society, our identification being, of course, Latinos, Chicanos, with historical cultural icons such as the Aztec warriors, is no better. And this is, of course, from the academic theorists or whatever else. Now, you're someone who's analyzed a lot of these counterinsurgencies directed at oppressed people. You documented it in Settlers, and you've written about it extensively in other writings as well. What is your perspective on that, and how do you think young Chicanos, in your view, look at this type of a criticism?
Well, all I can say is that as an Asian guy, Bruce Lee was an enormous cultural kind of divide to us, because before Bruce Lee, we had no role models. This sounds funny, I guess, to people today. We had no images, We weren't on TV, we weren't on movies, we just weren't there, right? Except that, we were the cooks,
Right.
In the Westerns, where there were almost no Mexicans because I guess they'd been killed.
Right.
And, the Indians were being killed, and then there'd always be one Chinese guy who would be doing the cooking because, the goddamn cowboys couldn't cook for themselves, I guess.
Of course.
But, we had no image of ourselves, and that was strong, And Bruce Lee was just fantastic in terms of that. And it just made an incredible difference, even though Bruce Lee was there's nothing radical about his ideas per se. But culturally it doesn't work like that. And I think a lot of the political correctness theory about who you should identify with or not is pretty artificial, and a lot of it is worse than artificial. I mean, I got to tell you, just as I don't know, this is a long explanation, but if you read this book, Occupied America, by Rodolfo Cuno.
Great book.
Great book.
Great book.
It's heavy. It's incredibly detailed and rich. Fantastically good book.
Definitely.
But he talks about Reese Tijerina, and he mentions, just like in a line, that in May and June 1968, Tijerina participated in the Poor People's Campaign. There he proved to be an independent leader, threatening to pull the Chicano contingent out if the black organizers did not treat them better. That's only one sentence. Well, to somebody who was there, to a lot of us who were there, Reese Tijerina was like, a stroke of lightning falling on us. It was just a tremendous thing, just meeting him and watching him and the other people from the Alliance, although I think at that time they're calling themselves the Confederation of Free City-States.
Right. It's very interesting. Jose Angel Gutierrez with La Raza Unida Party, one of the founders, calls Urias the Chicano Malcolm X for the way that he approached his politics and the way that he was just so out front about it.
He was just an incredibly strong guy, and just, I know I've heard there's criticism of him much later because he, I guess, got more conservative or got more tactical. I don't know. But I know that back then, it wasn't just that he led his guys and women and they occupied Kit Carson National Park, and took over land and arrested sheriff's deputies and things like that for their illegal acts. It was just tremendously just. It was just wonderful. It's just, and this is the kind of thing you don't get out of these history books, is, by that time, we're talking about 1968. those of us who had been through the civil rights movement had really got us into politics. A lot of us were pretty cynical and pretty disillusioned because, things had really, there was a lot of money to be made in the civil rights movement if you wanted to sell out, cater to various interests, political interests, and and the businesses and stuff.
Right.
There's a lot of corruption was starting to take place at the top. There's a lot of, bureaucracy. I mean, the Poor People's Campaign, that's what got King killed, Martin Luther King killed, because he said he got out of the straight civil rights thing, and he said, really, we need to unite all the poor people in America, and I'm calling for everybody to come to Washington, D.C., and we're going to just take over the D.C. Mall. We're going to live there. We're going to pitch tents, thousands and thousands. We're just going to live there until our demands are met. We're opposed to, we want the end of the Vietnam War. We want, all these things. Well, King had always very consciously had a policy, which he's public about. He fought local white Southern racists. He did not fight the federal government. He kept saying he's not fighting the federal government. This is when he decided he had to fight the federal government.
Right.
And he was proposing that all poor people unite in one movement against the government. Well, in my opinion, that's why they killed him. That was too much. He was supposed to be the safe alternative to Malcolm X and everybody, but he was turning radical himself. So even though he'd been assassinated during the preparations, his group went ahead and held a Poor People's Convention. Just imagine a sea of tents taking over Washington, the mall in Washington, which with the rain and everything else in the middle of the summer was just a sea of mud because thousands of people were living there and trampling there. And, it was like, frankly, conditions were kind of miserable. There was no food. I remember a lot of mornings for breakfast, well, adults, there would be no food. And because the inside civil rights people and the bureaucracy stole all the money that had been donated for food. Some of the kids would get little boxes of dry cereal, no milk or anything, and no fruit. So, when we met Reese and he heard about this, he just invited us all. I said, don't bring your kids, come to our place for lunch. He'd taken his people out, totally out. He took the Alliance out of the mud. He said, well, we don't have to live like this to make our point. And he demanded that, they find someplace better. In fact, they found a private school that was unoccupied during the summer and got permission for the Chicanos to use it. So hundreds of Chicanos moved in, fired up the kitchen. It was just a tremendous place. It was like a carnival, a school. It was just, So, Reese invited us and our kids to come eat lunch. It was just and he was an incredible guy because we were used to kind of these top-down leaders. I don't want to mention any names, but like the big leader
right.
would appear, after he wouldn't be staying with us, of course. He was staying at a luxury hotel in D.C., and literally, I'm not fooling it, a limousine would pull up, and this guy would get out. He'd have his, overalls, but they were brand new, starched. He'd just taken them out of the bag, his brand new starched, white T-shirt, lead us on a few chants, pop back into his limousine, drive off.
That's messed up.
And Tiarina was a kind of one-man leadership type guy. But, he interpreted that as meaning if the demonstration, he wanted everybody to get up at 8, he'd be up at 7. If there wasn't enough food, he'd eat last.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just really impressive. Actually, one of the things that impressed me the most is he had this phenomenal memory. You'd talk to him for like 2 minutes, then a week later, you'd meet him. He'd remember your name. He'd remember every word you said because he was really listening to you. I mean, it was like an amazing kind of thing. And the Crusade for Justice people from Denver, Jorge Gonzalez's people,
right?
they were really impressive. There were like about 400 of them. There were like about half Chicano, half black. Maybe I could be wrong. That's what it seemed to me. It was very much black, and very, very, shoulder to shoulder. It was really a tough group of people. So
it's kind of interesting. I've spoken with a documenter by the name of Jose Salvador Trevino, and he was a documenter of a lot of Corky Gonzalez's work and a lot of the Chicano the Raza Youth Liberation conferences that were held out in Denver. And I think one of the things that he mentioned as he was coming to consciousness was that as he grew up, it was kind of a given for him that there were Chicanos and there were oppressed people who were working lawns or who were going to jail and all these other things. But one of the things that he learned from a lot of these people who were involved in movements and who talked about history was that they put these things in a context, and they made sure that people understood that there is a systemic reason why oppressed people are at lower economic rungs in this society, and not just the reason that they're there is not because they're lazy or shiftless or whatever else that the educational system puts on you. And I think one of the things that Jesus has said before is that Corky really brought a lot of those ideas out to so many young people to understand that oppression is not just something that happens out in this vacuum, but is very deep and very historical, and there's a reason for it.
Well, the other thing is, and I really remember this about the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s, is that people really practiced a lot of solidarity between oppressed peoples that you hear some people talk about, but sometimes is more lip service than real. And people like, when AIM did the takeover at Wounded Knee and got surrounded by the U.S. Army and had the siege and, got shot up and everything.
Yeah.
The largest demonstration in the U.S. was in Denver supporting them. The only actual large one. And it was the Crusade for Justice. It was mostly Chicano. When affirmative action first started getting attacked in California, I remember this one, in the early 80s, the law school, I think it was at Berkeley, ended the quota for Asian Americans, and the Chicanos offered to give part of their slots to Asians to fight for the principle, of representation. And a lot of that spirit has been lost in this because, there's this thing that's happening, which is that what used to be kind of militant politics against systemic injustice, against capitalism as a system, has turned into ethnic politics for a lot of people, with the kind of veneer of seeming to be militant, protesting about this and that, but underneath it is an attitude of we should just look out for ourselves. We really shouldn't care about anybody else but ourselves. And everybody else we should say nice things, but potentially they could be an enemy. So we really should only think of us. And, I know that Asians are told that by conservative forces.
Right.
In our communities. And, certainly black people are told this. I mean, because it's kind of the American way you subvert militant consciousness in people's movements, is you try and make them more capitalist. Jefferson tried to do that with the Indians in the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy. He sent them messages saying, you should join the United States. Because, see, your laws, you're good people. We want to get together with you. But your laws aren't any good. That's why we really need to bring you into our country instead of just leaving you in your country. Because, see, your laws don't protect private property. You share everything in common, And although he didn't say it, of course, the Iroquois Confederacy, women had tremendous legal powers under their laws of government. You couldn't have a war unless 3/4 of the mothers, women who had born children, voted for the war, for example, under their laws. No men could vote for war. So this was this is the indigenous kind of, way of having a society that Jefferson said, well, this is completely crazy. You really need to join us and have our laws which protect private property. You can get rich, and then, you'll like it much, much better. And of course, what he really meant is, we want to take you over, and if you don't have private property, you can't sell us everything you have, which is what we want you to do. So we're going to get you to do this, or we're going to shoot you, one or the other, which is their kind of standard approach to these things, as we can see in Afghanistan and Iraq.
I was actually just about to mention that as well.
Yeah, they're bringing democracy to Iraq, only they don't seem to be doing a very good job of it right now.
You see a lot of mounting resistance.
I just think there's, the thing is that they're invading the whole world, essentially. And it's true that I guess they can conquer any part of it they want to. But that doesn't mean that people are going to like them or put up with it or not resist. Of course people are going to resist, from all kinds of points of view. And I don't think this is ever going to end until they leave. That's actually what I think. And I think the same thing is true for America. I don't think there's any solution to any of these problems here until they desettlerize America.
That's actually going to get into another question. If you're just tuning in, we're speaking tonight with Jay Sakai, an anti-imperialist author who wrote the book Settlers and has written a number of texts on race and revolution. We're getting a couple of different calls as well as emails in with questions. And I guess one of the questions that was actually just sent in a little while ago, how is a country desettlerized? The U.S. or Israel was an example that was given. And also, I guess a sub-question to that is, I'll read it off, especially in a place like the U.S. where many righteous national liberation movements, the Black, New African, and Chicano movements especially, overlap and contradict native land claims and national liberation. Where does that all fit in?
Well, I don't think any of us are going to have problems solving our relations with each other as long as we kind of get the U.S. empire and capitalist ripoffs out of the way. Because it isn't true that there's plenty of land in America. Everybody could live here, who lives here quite well, with a lot of autonomy, a lot of justice, a lot of room for expression and development. But the obstacle isn't each other in that sense. And as for desettlerization, it's already happening, because settlerism is a phenomenon of the past, really. All over the world, settler societies, well, you saw all the ones in Africa have essentially gone out of business. In Algeria, you had which was officially a province of France until the 1950s revolution, you had 1 million French settlers living there, and virtually the whole of the French army occupying it. And finally, they all had to leave. And Algeria has a lot of problems, but it is Algerian. I don't think that that's going to happen here, obviously, because there's no place, for that kind of migration to happen. But desettlerization isn't happening that way. Like in Israel is maintained. The problem is not that Jewish people live in Palestine. The problem is that there's special laws, unjust laws, that deny land to Palestinians who lived there, while, of course, giving land to Zionists, even though they may have no connection whatsoever to Palestine that anybody can prove, except they say that they have a follow the Jewish religion. They come from Russia, they come from Brooklyn, they come from wherever. Well, people look at America and they don't see how America could be desettlerized. But actually, it's being desettlerized right now. And it's funny, you know, like the place where I work, all the other guys who work there are Mexican. They're not Chicano, they're Mexican. And, I mean, the first generation, this is not their home. Their home is back in Mexico. And, you know, they're very conservative family people in a social way, much more conservative than I am, for sure. They're kind of exactly the kind of Mexicans that the Republican Party and Bush are trying to aim at as the ideal minority. In fact, some of the guys, I think, voted for Bush because he sounded like, you know, a better leader or something. So they're not radical in any political sense whatsoever. But, of course, it's interesting when you talk to them about America, they don't believe in the United States at all. Because what they think is that the United States and Mexico are really just kind of one country. To them, it isn't just Aztlán. It isn't just the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
It's that there's Mexico, which is a special place to them, a really good place. Too poor, but a good place. As they say, it has everything but money.
Right, right.
And then there's America. Lots of different people live here. They think that's great, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they think that's actually just how it should be. Because to them, they've noticed this funny thing. And this is I don't want to insult anybody, but the way they look at it is, they've noticed Americans don't like to work. They noticed that because we're in the suburbs, you know. We're in the wealthy suburbs.
Right.
Well, you know, there's Mexicans all over the place, of course, because all the landscaping,
Mm-hmm.
the porters, the guys, you know, unloading trucks, the people laying the masonry for the patio. I mean, all the workers are all Mexican. So their view is they don't quite understand America, but they've figured out one thing. Real Americans aren't into working. They don't understand it, but okay, fine by them. So to them, this is this huge land which, frankly, needs them because they're the people who are going to do the work. And they actually don't believe in a separate United States in any real sense of the word. You know, like immigration laws, borders. I mean, they just think that's nonsense. It isn't just because of the legal history. It's because really, to them, it's their country as much as anybody else's. And they're not nationalistic in any narrow sense about it. They talk about the fact that, yeah, Mexican guys live here and, you know, one guy knows guys married a Polish woman immigrated from Poland. He thinks that's great, you know. But to them, America doesn't belong to the people who call themselves Americans. That's the key difference where they differ from the Republicans and George Bush. So they have they're part of the actual reversal of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that's going on. Only it's happening in a very kind of modern or postmodern way. It isn't just simply a reversal in terms of the Southwest, where clearly the Southwest, the whole character of the Southwest is changing, you know, year by year. I'm in the Midwest, and, you know, when the Mexican consulate said it was going to issue the ID cards so that people could get bank accounts and everything else, I mean, we literally had a traffic jam. There were 10,000 people lined up on the main business street. It was just completely bizarre. And all the right-wingers are just are having fits because they're writing letters to the newspapers like, this Mexican ID card, you know, is as good as an American, you know, birth certificate. You can do all this. How can we let this happen? Well, but the logic of modern globalized life is that they have to. the banks want to have bank accounts with this money in it. So they want these people to have consular IDs, which aren't American in any way whatsoever. And you can just see, year by year, the whole shift starting to happen socially, culturally. That it has to happen in a political sense, of course, and it hasn't yet. But you certainly can see the underlying kind of migration that's a migration not just geographically, but is changing politics just as surely as when black people left the South and emigrated to the northern industrial cities, or when we Asians came to Hawaii and the West Coast in the 19th century.
Is that how you'd see desettlerization working, where you see this migration of peoples? It sounds like that's the way it's working in practice in the Midwest, and historically how it's worked for the South as well as the Northeast. Would you say that's how desettlerization will happen in the United States over the next few years as it is currently?
Well, that's the underlying kind of historical thing that's going to happen, but it isn't going to deal with the whole political struggle, which we're now engaged in, because, of course, the white settler population has essentially, they've had a historic 400-year pact with capitalism, which is that they will get the best of everything. Maybe that won't be a lot, but it will be the best of the little. They will get the best of everything that is available in return for supporting capitalism and the U.S. empire and its conquest over other people and its exploitation. Well, frankly, that globalization and the desettlerization of North America is threatening that. And how long can you have a population in which more and more people don't actually work? I mean, the real welfare problem, you say the word welfare in America, and everybody's supposed to picture a black woman in a housing project. Well, the real welfare is white middle-class people, where you have entire office buildings in cities full of people who don't actually produce anything. They move paper around, they build people, they do things, but they don't actually produce anything. Everything that's produced is produced somewhere else by somebody else. And the question is, how long can that be maintained? I would say it's breaking down even now. It certainly is in Europe, and that's why there's fascist movements and all this right-wing stuff happening in Europe.
Definitely.
Because the social compact is breaking down, and it's going to happen here too. And the political struggle, it is not going to happen peacefully, in the sense of it isn't going to be some gradual social process, The underlying economics are one thing. The political struggle over who gets what out of that and whether there'll be a just society or not is a whole other question.
More questions from the audience. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about your writing, and how do you respond to some of the critics who have written about your writing?
Well, actually, although I've heard a lot of criticism, there hasn't been a lot of writing criticizing it. I always tell people, well, I don't have a problem with criticism. Just write down factually, where the mistakes are, and we can argue about that. At that point, people disappear because, they can't seem to locate those things. And I'd say the biggest misconception, though, is people think I'm talking about race alone, that everything is determined in America by race, and that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that race in America has been used as an identifier for capitalism to form and control classes. That race is really not just a metaphor for class, but an identifier of class in real terms. And so that everything is really upside down. Things that are racial are really about class, like affirmative action. Well, the real affirmative action is the enormous built-in advantages that white middle-class people, particularly from the suburban school systems, have at getting into universities and getting corporate jobs and networking. And everybody knows this. It's not a big deal. It's just facts, right? So that's the actual affirmative action. These other programs are really, to compensate for that, are just the warped forms that the civil rights victories of the 1960s forced upon the society. I mean, I don't really view them as, personally, as that significant. And the fight over them really is a fight, in a funny way, within settler society, within imperialism itself, over how it's going to manage itself. So that in the University of Michigan case, where Bush, supposedly on the advice of Condoleezza Rice, his African-American advisor, has weighed in on the side of opposing the university's affirmative action program, all of a sudden, all the three former Joint Chiefs of Staff, heads of the former West Point and Naval Academy, General Motors, Microsoft, and dozens of other major corporations have all filed briefs supporting affirmative action. So this is a fight. We're not in this fight, actually. I mean, this is like a pure ruling class fight, having it out with each other. And that's what's interesting about it, actually. It's their problem. Since it originally arose over law school, not something I would ever myself want to do or urge that any sane person do, I really could care less.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience: to what extent does your analysis depart, the analysis you just mentioned in regard to race and class, how does that depart from traditional Marxism that reduces everything to class? And where does your analysis, relate to or differ from anti-racist feminism presented by people like Gloria Anzaldúa, who say that all systems of oppression are connected in some way?
Well, to the last, I really agree. I mean, all systems of oppression are connected. It's sometimes the difficulty is figuring out what these connections are. And part of the problem that I have with anti-racist feminism is that a lot of it is very middle class, and it's used to actually muddy the question of oppression, i.e. suddenly everybody's oppression is equal. Well, actually, everybody's oppression isn't equal. And I tend to be pretty concrete about those things myself.
Thank you.
It's like, I can't count the number of people. In fact, growing up in a Japanese-American family, you've been to camp. When I was a little kid, people talked about camp, going to camp. This happened at camp. When I was a little kid, I didn't know that camp, this is deliberate. And it happened in almost everybody's family. It was a way of talking about being in the concentration camps without, being blunt and saying this, right? So if you're being overheard or whatever by the kids, it isn't anything, they don't know what you're talking about. I didn't actually find out about concentration camps till white people started stopping me on the street and giving me various explanations of why I shouldn't blame them for it. When I was a young kid. And I can't count the number of people who told me that, this wasn't a real concentration camp you and your family were in. That was the Jews in Germany. See, they all got killed. That was the real concentration camp. You weren't really in a concentration camp. Oh, thanks. Well, actually, I would never say I've never met a Japanese American who said that what we went through was anything like what the Jews in Europe went through under Nazism. I've literally never heard anybody even hint that that could be true, because that would be crazy. You'd have to be a nut to think that. But it doesn't mean that what we went through wasn't real. It doesn't mean that there weren't terrible human losses out of it. And it doesn't mean that the reparations program that Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton did, isn't just a piece of junk, in my opinion, compared to what happened. It is not any actual reparations or justice. But, there's this funny thing where middle-class people are always inventing trendy ways to be oppressed, in which their oppression is somehow just as real as yours. Actually, I don't think so, but it's not my appointed task in life to argue with them. I do think, and this is true, that because of the interconnection of oppressions is something we still don't understand real well. Like a lot of people were having this political fight over Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which was supposed to be so radical because it says he was killed by a conspiracy.
Right.
Well, this is this complete piece of junk. I mean, who were the conspirators in the movie? I was sitting in the movie, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Well, the conspirators were this group of gay, stereotype, mincing kind of queens, who at one point even wear dresses, right? So gay people were the conspiracy that, killed JFK. This is the progressive, radical, threatening movie. I mean, give me a break here. This is nothing but homophobic junk. If you really wanted to have a movie in which you really showed the people who killed JFK, they'd be white guys wearing three-piece suits and sitting in corporate boardrooms and hanging out at the Pentagon. I mean, they wouldn't be like gay people from Latin America. Give me a break. The fact that could even go over in America without people just, burning down movie theaters shows how deeply ingrained the homophobia in this society is. For real.
Absolutely so. Absolutely. If you are just tuning in, we're speaking tonight with Jay Sakai, author of Settlers, as well as many other essays. Jay, we're running into the last about minute and a half to the show. Can you let people know, just kind of give people an idea of some of the things you're working on these days? I know you're doing some other writing, and just kind of let people know just what you've been up to at this point and some of the things to kind of keep an eye out for.
Well, actually, along with some other comrades, I've been working on trying to better understand the whole new popular wave of far right-wing politics and fascism in the world. Because to us, that's the new threatening phenomena that's happening. And, not just in Europe, but here in India, etc. So you always got to watch these... Hey, you got to watch the new semi-trailer coming up in your rearview mirror threatening to drive you off the road.
Definitely. No doubt about that.
Okay.
Beautiful. You are listening to Sexto Sol on 90.1 FM, KPFT in Houston. We've been speaking tonight with Jay Sakai. Jay, thank you very, very much for your time. We had quite a few more questions, but we couldn't get to everybody. Thank you very, very much for your time this evening.
It was a pleasure. Take care.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.